Ever had that instant flash of recognition, a gut feeling about something, a person, a decision that just, well, arrives before you can even put a finger on why?
Oh, definitely.
Maybe it was right, maybe wildly off? That's the fascinating territory we're diving into today. The power and the potential pitfalls of thinking without thinking, often called thin slicing.
Exactly. Thin slicing is our brain's remarkable ability to pull out surprisingly rich information from really brief encounters to make these incredibly rapid judgments based on just a sliver, a thin slice of experience.
It's like our minds are experts at pattern recognition, spotting things instantly.
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah.
Sorting through information without us even realizing it. And the results can be, well, quite astonishing sometimes.
Okay, so let's unpack this. We've gathered some really compelling research and stories that show how this works, in the real world. Everything from fine art to human relationships. Our goal here is really to give you a clear handle on this powerful aspect of how your mind operates, its strengths, its weaknesses, without getting bogged down in, like, academic speak.
And it's quite a journey we've got lined up. We'll kick off with a mystery in the art world involving a potentially faked ancient statue.
Okay.
Then we'll shift to a gambling experiment that reveals just how fast our unconscious learning can be. And we'll even look at how those first fleeting moments between couples might actually hint at their long-term success.
Wow, okay. And we're also looking at first impressions, right? How accurate we are with strangers.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And why those initial reads matter. But it's not always accurate, is it? We'll definitely examine times when these blink reactions go terribly wrong.
Including a look at a real-world tragedy that really highlights the dangers.
Yeah, understanding when thin slicing is reliable and when it's not is, well, it's crucial. So we'll talk about how things like training and context can sharpen our snap judgments.
And even things like, why do we prefer Coke over Pepsi? Or find one chair comfy and another not?
Right. Even though seemingly simple preferences have deeper roots in these rapid unconscious assessments than you might think.
Okay, let's plunge right in. First up, the mystery surrounding the Getty Koros.
Ah, yes, the Kuros. So the Getty Museum acquired this statue, the classic ancient Greek sculpture form, but almost immediately a big debate blew up about whether it was actually authentic.
And what's so interesting here is the contrast, right, between how they tried to figure it out.
Totally. On one hand, you have the Getty investing tons of time and money into scientific analysis,
Yeah.
digging into its history, its provenance.
Doing all the rigorous scientific checks you'd expect for, a major museum piece.
Exactly. But then you had these really seasoned experts in Greek sculpture over in Athens.
Okay.
And when they saw it, they just felt this immediate unease, an intuitive repulsion, as Angelos Dilavorius, director of the Benaki Museum, put it.
Intuitive repulsion. That's strong.
It is. And these weren't just vague feelings. George Despinis, head of the Acropolis Museum, he was very direct. He said, basically, anyone who's seen real sculptures dug up knows that thing has never been in the ground.
Wow. That's quite a statement, based purely on experience, on that feel.
Absolutely. It shows that expertise isn't just book smarts. It's this, like, unconscious buildup of patterns you just know sometimes before you can explain why.
Right. And wasn't there another expert, Norgios?
Yeah, head of the Archaeological Society in Athens.
Yeah.
He also had this gut reaction, felt a kind of barrier between him and the statue right away.
So you've got this real tension, Getty science versus the expert's intuition.
Exactly. And as time went on, the Getty scientific case, well, it started to crumble.
So?
The provenance, the history they'd carefully traced, it started looking really shaky.
Mm-hmm.
Letters meant to trace it back to a Swiss doctor turned out to be fakes.
Fakes? Like, ow!
Well, so it's almost funny, really. One letter, supposedly from 1952, used a postal code that didn't exist for another 20 years.
Oh, come on.
Yeah. And another, from 55, mentioned a bank account that wasn't opened until, like, 1963. Big problems.
Definitely casts doubt on the whole story.
And then there was the style. Initially, they thought it looked like another genuine Kouros, the Anavisos Kouros. But the more experts looked, the more it seemed like a mashup, like bits and pieces from different statues, different times, different places. A pastiche, really.
So not a unified whole, almost like a forgery would be, taking inspirations.
Precisely. Proportions from one, hair from another. Even the feet looked weirdly modern. And here's the kicker. It looks suspiciously like another statue fragment, a known fake linked to a forger's workshop in Rome in the 80s.
No way.
Yep, and carved from similar marble, too. It really started to look bad for the Getty Kouros.
But what about the science? Didn't tests show the surface was old, aged over centuries?
Well, that's another twist. Turns out you can apparently fake the aging on that type of marble dolomite marble in just a few months, using potato mold, believe it or not.
Potato mold.
Yeah. So that scientific evidence wasn't so solid after all.
So where does that leave the statue now?
Well, the Getty's own catalog entry now reads, about 530 BC or modern forgery.
Wow. So they basically admit they don't know. That's a huge shift.
It really is.
Mm-hmm.
And it perfectly shows how that deep expert intuition, that unconscious pattern recognition, can sometimes nail it faster and maybe even more accurately than all the conscious analysis, especially with authenticity.
Fascinating. Okay, let's shift gears completely. Tell me about the Iowa gambling task.
Right. This was a cool experiment looking at decision-making under uncertainty.
How'd it work?
Basically, people chose cards from 4 decks, 2 red, 2 blue.
Okay.
The red decks gave bigger rewards sometimes, but also huge penalties, so overall you'd lose money. The blue decks had smaller rewards, but also smaller penalties, so you'd consistently win money over time.
So blue good, red bad in the long run.
Exactly. But the really clever part wasn't just seeing which decks people eventually preferred.
It was when they figured it out.
Sort of. It was when their bodies figured it out. They hooked participants up to measure palm sweat. Physiological sign of stress.
Ah, okay, like a lie detector test almost.
Kind of. And what they found was amazing. Around the 10th card, people started showing a stress response. Sweaty palms, just when they considered picking from the bad red decks.
The 10th card? That's really early. Did they know the decks were bad then?
Nope, not consciously. That didn't happen until around the 50th card, much later. Their bodies were sending warning signals way before their conscious minds caught up.
So the body knew before the mind knew. That suggests our intuition is maybe more tuned into risk.
Seems like it. And what's more, around the same time their palms got sweaty, their actual behavior started shifting. They began favoring the good blue decks.
Even though they couldn't say why.
Exactly. They figured the game out before they realized they'd figured it out. Their unconscious mind picked up the pattern.
That's incredible. It really shows those two different systems at work, doesn't it?
Absolutely. You've got the slow, deliberate, conscious thinking, weighing the pros and cons.
Right.
And then you've got this super fast, unconscious system that's constantly scanning for patterns and guiding us, often through these gut feelings or, sweaty palms.
Yeah.
Implicit learning.
Yeah, those subtle signals our intuition sends. Okay, let's take this to an even more complex area. Marriage. Predicting success or failure. That sounds ambitious.
It does, but John Gottman's work in his Love Lab is pretty staggering.
Tell me about it.
Well, Gottman has spent decades studying thousands of couples. He videotapes them interacting, usually talking about a point of conflict.
Okay.
And then he uses this incredibly detailed coding system called SEPSI-FF specific affect. It breaks down their emotional expressions like second by second.
Second by second. What kind of emotions?
Everything. Tiny flashes of disgust, contempt, defensiveness, warmth, humor. There are about 20 categories. They code facial expressions, tone of voice, body language, super granular stuff.
So it's not just what they say, but how they say it and all the nonverbal stuff?
Precisely.
Yeah.
And he doesn't stop there. He also tracks physiological data, heart rate, skin temperature, even how much they fidget.
Wow. And what does he do with all that data?
Feeds it into these complex equations. He's essentially looking for the underlying pattern, the signature of their interaction style.
A signature?
Yeah, calls it the marital fist. It's like how old-school Morse code operators could identify each other just by their unique rhythm, their fist.
Ah, I see. So every couple has a unique, stable way of interacting.
That's the idea, a characteristic pattern. And Gottman argues that by observing just a small slice of that interaction, you can read the fist and get a really good sense of the relationship's overall health.
Just a small slice. How small?
Well, he claims he's gotten so good at this thin slicing of marriages, he can sometimes listen to a couple chat in a restaurant for just a few minutes and make a pretty accurate call on whether they're headed for trouble.
That is unbelievable. Is there a secret? What's he looking for?
He found he doesn't need to track everything. He focuses on what he calls the 4 horsemen of relationship apocalypse.
Okay, the 4 horsemen, what are they?
They are defensiveness, stonewalling that's like shutting down criticism, and the most important one, contempt.
Contempt. Why is that the worst? Worse than criticism.
Yeah. Gottman says criticism attacks character like you always, but contempt is nastier. It's talking down, mocking, insulting, acting like you're superior.
Ah, so it's about disrespect. Like you're an idiot, not just you did something wrong.
Exactly. Like signals disgust, really. And seeing contempt is a huge red flag. His research even links it to physical health, like how often partners get colds.
Seriously, just being on the receiving end of contempt makes you sick.
Seems like it. The stress of feeling disrespected by someone you love apparently takes a toll on the immune system. It's such a strong predictor because it suggests a fundamental lack of respect.
It's just amazing you can predict so much from spotting these specific emotional cues in like a 15-minute conversation.
It really is. It shows how much information is packed into those interactions, if you know what to look for.
Okay, let's switch again. What about first impressions of people we don't know? Like personality, likability.
Another area where thin slicing is huge. There's some cool research by Samuel Gosling. He looked at whether strangers could judge personality traits, the big five,
Extroversion, agreeableness.
Right, conscientiousness, emotional stability,
Wow.
openness to experience. Could people judge those just by looking at someone's dorm room?
Their dorm room, not even meeting the person.
Exactly, just looking at their personal space.
Then could they?
Surprisingly well, yeah. The way we arrange our stuff, the things we choose to display, it sends out signals about who we are, even unconsciously.
That makes sense, actually. A super neat room might suggest conscientiousness. Maybe lots of posters and art suggests openness.
Right, our environment is like a thin slice of our personality. Now, let's talk likability. It's a bit different, more interaction-based maybe, but equally powerful.
How so?
Well, think about this quote from Alice Boscan, a malpractice lawyer. People just don't sue doctors they like.
Wow. That's blunt.
But think about it. Even if a mistake happens, if the patient feels that connection, feels respected and cared for, they're much less likely to sue.
So the relationship buffers the error almost.
Exactly. Bergen told a story about a client wanting to sue her internist over a missed cancer diagnosis, even though the radiologist might have been more at fault.
Why the internist?
Because the client disliked her, felt rushed, ignored, not treated like a whole person. That feeling, that lack of likability and connection, drove the lawsuit.
So it wasn't just about the medical facts, it was the interpersonal feeling.
Absolutely. And you see this elsewhere, too. Brian Grazer, the Hollywood producer, he talks about seeing Tom Hanks audition for Splash.
Yeah.
Grazer said he knew instantly Hanks had it. Maybe other actors were funnier, but Hanks just radiated likability. Grazer felt audiences would root for him.
And that gut feeling paid off, obviously.
Hugely. Grazer even used that feeling later for casting Apollo 13. Who does the world most want to see come home safe? Tom Hanks. Because we like him.
Even though we don't know him personally, we get that thin slice from his performances.
Precisely. We form this strong impression of likability, and it really affects how we respond.
So these quick judgments, whether from a room or an audition, have real weight. Okay, let's dig into the unconscious side more, the storytelling problem. What's that about?
Well, remember the tennis coach, Vic Braden?
Vaguely. He could predict double faults.
Yeah, he often knew when a player was about to double fault, but he couldn't explain how he knew. The prediction just popped into his head, fully formed from his unconscious.
Right, reinforcing that these judgments are fast and often hidden from our conscious mind.
Exactly, which leads us into research on priming.
Priming, like getting someone ready for something.
Sort of. It's about how subtle, often unnoticed cues can influence our subsequent thoughts and behavior without us realizing it. John Bargh did some classic experiments.
Like what?
In one, people did a scrambled sentence test. For some, the sentences subtly included words related to old age like Florida, wrinkle, gray. Afterwards, those people, without knowing why, actually walked more slowly down the hall than the control group.
Seriously. Just reading those words unconsciously activated the concept of old and slowed them down.
That's the idea. Their behavior was primed. Another experiment primed students with words related to either rudeness or politeness. Those primed with rude words were much more likely to interrupt the experimenter later on, again unconsciously influenced.
That's kind of disturbing. How much we can be nudged without knowing it.
It is, and you see this play out on things like speed dating, too.
How so?
People make decisions incredibly fast. You hear things like, they lost me at hello, instant judgments. And often, what people say they want in a partner beforehand doesn't match who they actually click with in that quick meeting.
So our conscious criteria don't always align with our unconscious reactions.
Very often they don't. Which brings us to this storytelling problem. We're not very good at knowing why we make these snap judgments, even if they're right.
We just make up reasons afterwards.
Pretty much. Mayer's rope experiment is a great example. People had to tie 2 ropes hanging from the ceiling. but they were too far apart to reach both.
Okay, a classic puzzle.
The solution is to swing one rope. Mayer would subtly bump one rope, giving an unconscious hint. People would suddenly solve it right after the hint.
But they didn't realize the hint helped.
Nope. When asked how they figured it out, they'd invent stories. Oh, it reminded me of swinging as a kid, or I thought about pendulums. Plausible, but wrong. They didn't mention Mayer bumping the rope.
So we're often blind to the real influences on our choices, but we hate feeling ignorant.
Exactly. We create narratives to make sense of ourselves. Like the juror in the O.J. Simpson trial who insisted race played zero part in her decision. How could she possibly know that for sure, given everything we know about unconscious bias?
Right. We need to be more okay with admitting we don't always know why we feel or do things.
We really do, especially when those feelings bubble up from that fast, unconscious part of the brain. We need to be wary of the stories we tell ourselves about our own snap judgments.
That's a really important caution. Okay, now let's look at when thin slicing goes badly wrong. Starting with Warren Harding.
Ah, President Harding.
Yeah.
A classic case of a snap judgment based purely on looks having massive consequences.
What was the judgment?
Harry Daugherty, a key political operator, basically decided Harding should be president because he looked like a president. Tall, distinguished, handsome, the whole package.
Just based on looks, not on his record or ideas.
Largely, yeah. Harding wasn't exactly known for his sharp intellect or policy substance. His speeches were famously described as just empty phrases looking for an idea.
Huh, okay.
But he looked the part, and Daugherty pushed him. When the Republican convention deadlocked in 1920, guess who emerged as the compromise candidate?
Harding, the guy who looked presidential.
Exactly. And he won.
Yeah.
But history?
Yeah.
Well, history generally ranks him as one of the worst presidents ever.
A cautionary tale about judging books by their covers, especially for important jobs.
Absolutely. It shows the danger of letting a superficial thin slice override deeper assessment. Now let's shift to a much, much more tragic example. Amadou Diallo.
Right. The shooting in New York City.
Yes. A truly devastating example of how a failure in rapid cognition, in reading a situation and a person's intent under pressure, can be fatal.
Remind us of the basics. What happened?
4 police officers, part of a street crime unit, saw Diallo, an unarmed West African immigrant, outside his apartment building late at night.
Yeah.
They thought he looked suspicious.
Okay.
As they approached, he paused, then ran into the building's vestibule. The officers followed, shouting commands. Diallo reached into his pocket.
For his wallet, right.
For his wallet, yes, to get his ID. But the officers saw him reach, and in that split second, under immense stress, they misinterpreted the action. They thought he was reaching for a gun.
They perceived a threat that wasn't there.
Exactly. Their perception was narrowed by the stress. One officer later said he thought he saw the slide of a black gun. They fired 41 shots. Diallo was killed.
It's horrific. And it raises that question. Why couldn't they see he was scared, not aggressive?
That's the core issue. We know from work by people like Sylvan Tompkins and Paul Ekman that faces transmit emotions very clearly through tiny muscle movements, action units.
Even microexpressions, those flashes that last fractions of a second.
Yes. Ekman showed he could spot a suicidal patient's hidden despair through a fleeting microexpression, even when she was trying to seem okay. Our faces often betray our true feelings.
So Diallo's fear should theoretically have been visible.
You'd think so. But the officer's ability to read those cues seems to have been severely compromised.
Why? What happens under that kind of extreme stress?
Research with officers involved in shootings, like David Klinger's work, shows strange things happen. Tunnel vision, where your visual field narrows dramatically. Auditory exclusion, where sounds seem muffled or disappear. Time can feel like it's slowing down.
Like a state of shock.
Almost. Some call it temporary autism, where your focus becomes intensely narrow, fixed on the perceived threat, blocking out other information, including social and emotional cues. You lose the ability to mind read effectively.
That makes the misinterpretation more understandable, but still tragic.
It does. Bob Martin, a former LAPD officer, talks about the adrenaline surge, the dog-in-the-hunt mentality in pursuits where officers can miss vital information or even ignore commands.
And aren't there studies suggesting multiple officers can sometimes make things worse?
Yeah, Jeffrey Altert and William Smith found 2 officer patrols might sometimes escalate situations more than single officers, maybe due to a diffusion of responsibility or a kind of group arousal.
It seems like the approach is often where things go wrong.
That's what Fife study in Dade County suggested. Officers might handle the physical engagement okay, but critical mistakes happen in the lead-up, the way they approach, which increases the chance of violence.
So training becomes absolutely critical, not just in tactics, but in managing stress and perception.
Absolutely vital. People like Dave Grossman and Gavin DeBecker work on training officers to manage their physiological stress response, to stay more aware, to make better split-second decisions under pressure.
Is it possible to overcome that tunnel vision?
There are anecdotes suggesting yes, like an officer who initially saw a suspect reaching for a gun, but then in that instant realized it was actually something falling down inside the guy's pants.
So he reevaluated his initial snap judgment, even under pressure.
Exactly. It shows that accurate perception, even reassessment, is possible. But the Diallo case is just this stark reminder of the catastrophic cost when that rapid cognition fails in high-stakes moments.
A failure of thin slicing with the worst possible outcome.
It really underscores the need for constant training, awareness of biases, and understanding how stress warps perception. Okay, let's shift focus again to the nuances of preference and expertise, especially with consumer products.
Like the new Coke disaster. That's a famous one.
Absolutely classic, a perfect cautionary tale. Coca-Cola did tons of blind sip tests. People overwhelmingly preferred the taste of the new formula.
So the data looked great. Launch it.
Right, but when they actually launched new Coke, replacing the original formula, massive public backlash. People hated it. They had to bring back Coke Classic.
Why the disconnect? The sip tests were clear.
Well, Carol Dollard, who worked at Pepsi, pointed out something crucial. A single sip in a controlled test is not the same as drinking a whole can or bottle at home as part of your routine.
Ah, the context is totally different.
Totally. Central location tests, CLTs,
Yeah.
don't always capture a real-world experience. And then there's the work of Louis Cheskin on unconscious associations.
What did you find?
He showed that things like packaging, color, brand name stuff that has nothing to do with the actual taste hugely influence our perception. His Imperial margarine example is famous.
Margarine.
Yeah. He advised the company to call it Imperial, put a crown on the package, make it yellow, wrap it in foil. All cues associated with high quality, like butter. And people consistently said the margarine tasted better in the fancy Imperial packaging, even though it was the exact same margarine inside. The unconscious cues changed their perception of the taste.
Wow. So the wrapping literally made it taste better in their mind.
Pretty much. And marketers use this all the time, right? A sprig of parsley on the Hormel logo implies freshness. Peaches in a glass jar feel more homemade than in a can. These little things affect perceived quality and what we'll pay.
So back to New Coke. The mistake was ignoring the brand.
Exactly. As one executive, Rhea, argued, people weren't just drinking cola, they were drinking Coca-Cola, with all its history, imagery, and emotional connection. The sip tests ignored all that. They focused only on taste in a vacuum.
They missed the power of the unconscious associations with the original brand.
Totally. Which ties into the importance of context for expertise, too. Think about the musician Kenna.
Okay, what's his story?
Music industry insiders, the experts, often heard his music and had this immediate, strong, positive reaction. They felt intuitively that he could be huge, appeal to the masses.
Their gut feeling said star.
Right. But then, when they did formal market testing, playing snippets for regular audiences,
Yeah.
the reaction wasn't nearly as strong. It didn't confirm the expert's thin slice.
Why the difference?
Context again. The experts were often hearing him live or hearing full songs, maybe influenced by buzz from other insiders. The market testing was like a blind taste test, short, out-of-context clips. Didn't capture whatever magic the experts are sensing.
So judging kind of out of context was like judging Coke just on a sip. You miss the bigger picture.
Exactly. Thin slicing often needs the right slice, the relevant context, to be accurate. And this applies even to things like office chairs. Herman Miller and the Aaron chair.
Ah, the mesh chair. I know that one. Revolutionary design, right?
Ergonomically, yes.
Right.
But visually, totally unconventional for its time. All that mesh, the weird shape. People were used to big, plush, padded chairs.
So the initial reaction was,
Pretty negative, based just on looks. People's snap judgment was, that looks weird and uncomfortable.
even though it was actually super ergonomic.
Right. So Herman Miller had to do tons of use testing, get people to actually sit in it for a while, let the comfort override the initial visual bias.
Let the experience correct the thin slice.
Exactly. And even then, some corporate clients resisted because it just didn't look like what they thought an executive chair should look like. Aesthetics created a barrier.
Interesting. So first impressions can be powerful, even for something practical like a chair. What about experts in taste? like food critics, can they explain their judgments?
That leads to Jonathan Schooler's strawberry jam experiment. Really interesting.
Oh, wow.
He had college students rate different strawberry jams. Then he compared their ratings to expert food tasters from Consumer Reports.
And were the students any good?
On average, yeah, the students' overall preferences lined up pretty well with the experts. They could generally tell good jam from bad jam. But
There's always a but.
when Schooler asked another group of students to not just rate the jams, but also write down their reasons why they liked or disliked them, their rating suddenly became much less accurate. They no longer matched the experts' rankings nearly as well.
Just thinking about why they liked it messed up their judgment.
Exactly. It's the storytelling problem again. Making them consciously analyze their preference seemed to interfere with their more intuitive, accurate gut feeling.
What did they focus on when they had to explain?
They'd latch onto things they could easily describe, like maybe the texture, the chunkiness of the jam, even if that wasn't really driving their overall liking. They focused on easily articulable details, potentially ignoring the more holistic taste experience.
So introspection can actually make your judgment worse if you're not an expert.
It seems so, in some cases. It leads you to rationalize based on plausible but potentially irrelevant factors. Experts, like the food tasters or Gottman or Vic Brayton, have built up that huge unconscious database through years of experience and feedback. Their intuition is trained.
They have a better sense of what really matters, even if they can't always articulate it perfectly either.
Right. And for most of us, our sensory knowledge for subtle differences is pretty shallow. Think Coke versus Pepsi again. The actual taste difference is small below the difference threshold for many people.
Difference threshold.
Yeah, the minimum difference needed to reliably detect a change. Most people struggle in a triangle test, picking the odd 1 out of 3 samples, 2 Coke, 1 Pepsi, or vice versa.
Even regular cola drinkers.
Often, yes.
Yeah.
It shows our everyday sensory knowledge isn't that precise. So forcing non-experts to deeply analyze why they prefer Coke over Pepsi beyond just, I like it better, can make their answers pretty meaningless. They lack the vocabulary and the trained palate.
Okay, so let's try and wrap this up. Thin slicing. It's this powerful, fast, unconscious cognitive tool.
Definitely. Our brains process huge amounts of info, rapidly, often accurately, letting us make judgments from seemingly limited data.
And it's a big but, it's fallible.
Hugely fallible. Snap judgments are hit by biases, the context matters enormously, and our level of real expertise in that specific area is critical. We saw how Harding's presidential look was misleading.
And we have to be aware of all the things that can distort it, right? Subtle priming we don't notice. The intense pressure of stress narrowing our view, like in the Diallo tragedy.
Right, making us unable to read cues that might otherwise be obvious.
And also being careful about the stories we tell ourselves after the fact. Trying to explain our intuition can actually lead us astray because of that storytelling problem.
Exactly. We can fabulate reasons thinking we understand our own minds better than we often do.
So maybe a final thought for everyone listening. Think about a time you had a really strong first impression, good or bad. Based on what we've talked about today, what factors might have been influencing that snap judgment? Was it context, bias, a genuine thin slice of something real? How might understanding this thinking without thinking change how you approach those situations now?
Yeah, it's really about finding that balance, isn't it? Between trusting your gut, that powerful thin slicing ability,
Right.
and also critically examining those initial reactions.
Sure.
Knowing when to trust it and when to maybe step back and gather more information before making a final call.
Yeah.
Cultivating that awareness.